I lived there actually. For
Really?
A year and a half. Yeah.
It's a lovely city. I actually like it.
I don't know what it looks like now.
They've cleaned up a lot of the heavy shipbuilding and such. So
Oh, Goldstone.
yeah. Yeah. Taipei is just going super modern. They have the tallest building in the world now. Yeah, until Abu Dhabi finishes.
Ladies and gentlemen, why don't we get started? My name is Jeff DeBelco. I direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. I want to welcome you all to the Wilson Center for a seminar this afternoon that really continues in a line of sessions that we've been having here at the center that look at linkages between demography, conflict cooperation, security, a whole set of links from different angles. For some of you in the audience, this is a continuation of a smaller series that we had, particularly for USAID and some of their grantees that looked at population health and fragility, a series of meetings that Jack, in fact, was the speaker in, and Rich Sincata and some of the folks here in the room participated in. But suffice it to say, we're very pleased because today's discussion comes on top of some discussions that came before, and there are resources on our website that we hope you will take advantage of in terms of catching up with some of those discussions if you weren't able to be in the room in the first place. A word about the center, this may be old hat for some of you veterans, but we're sitting in the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. As the only president with a PhD, the Congress thought it would be more appropriate to set up a living memorial where practitioners and scholars could come together for exchange in providing fora that are perhaps a little rare in town these days, given the fact that Wilson Center is nonpartisan, non-advocacy. So we really try to take advantage of that and build some safe space for dialogue across some groups that don't always talk. The Environmental Change and Security Program is now 13-year old program that tries to facilitate these kinds of discussions within the areas of environment, health, population, development issues, and then understand those in the context of foreign policy and security policy, so something we're doing quite explicitly today. Many of our meetings, and today's is included, are very generously supported by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, so it's terrific to see some of those folks here as well, and so we appreciate their support to facilitate some of these discussions that at times are very practical, hands-on, in the field, on the ground type discussions, and at other times really try to understand how these phenomena and these dynamics in the broadest terms, in analytical terms, how they come together, and something that we will really be looking at today as we discuss and hear a presentation from Dr. Jack Goldstone, who is the Virginia E. and John T. Hazel Jr. Professor of Public Policy at George Mason School of Public Policy, and he's Director of Center for Global Policy and Editor of Foreign Policy Bulletin. Jack is someone who is well known to those of you who are veterans of the Wilson Center, and certainly those of you who've read your conflict studies work, particularly trying to understand, well, not particularly, but including trying to understand how demography is connected to conflict and theories of revolutions. Jack is someone who has done and made a number of kind of path-breaking contributions on the analytical side, but has also been very active in advising and governments and participating in policy processes to bring some of these insights to bear. And you'll see in the bios some of the details of the programs that he's been involved in. The then State Failure Task Force, now Political Instability Task Force, being one particularly notable endeavor that Jack has done, including also, I should say, some work for USAID. So Jack has a paper, Flashpoints and Tipping Points, Security Implications of Global Population Changes, 2005 to 2025. And in talking to Jack, I've always urged him to let us know when he has papers that he can have, that he would like to come and discuss here. And so this is one case where he's presented this in a number of policy fora, particularly in Europe, and was interested in having the discussion here in Washington with a mix of analysts and government representatives, practitioners. So we're thrilled that Jack has come today and will share his insights with us. This was also an opportunity for us to have another colleague in our network who'd largely been a colleague on the internet and had not been one that we'd met in person. But this was a terrific opportunity for us to invite Eric Kaufmann to come to Washington, coming originally from Vancouver, but really spending, I think, the last 14 years in the UK, where he is a reader in politics and sociology at Birkbeck College, the University of London. Done an awful lot of work in trying to understand the links between demography and nationalism, demography and ethnicity, and religion as well, in terms of differential population growth rates and what that means in connecting some of these issues up to conflict. So Eric has been someone who, a conference that I unfortunately wasn't able to attend, but Rich Capita and Jack Goldstone certainly did here this last year, that he did with support from the Economic and Social Research Council, that really got a lot of buzz, and including now, I think, plans for some edited volumes. So Eric has kind of a good sense of the literature and what others are doing, but also his research itself really bears on this. So we asked him to make a few comments about Jack's paper, as well as some thoughts on his research and how he sees bearing on this topic as a way to kick off our discussion. A final word for me is that we are broadcasting this program live on the web. It will be archived, and so you can direct people to the Wilson Center website to see this program in the future. But it also means when it comes time to the Q&A, I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone. Let us know who you are, but then with the microphone, the folks online can hear your question as well. So Jack, can I turn the floor over to you?
Thank you, Jeff. A lot of these events at the Wilson Center are launches of a particular work. I'm not launching any particular work. I'm not asking you to buy anything except the ideas here. This is a launch for the concept of political demography, because demography is seen by many people, frankly, as boring. It's a matter of how many babies women have or how many old people there are in the population. And what I've been arguing for much of my career is that these simple demographic issues have big consequences for a variety of issues that people really should care about. And in particular, I'm going to talk today about global development and global security. I think demography is far too important to be left to demographers alone. The phrase is sometimes put out there that demography is destiny, or it's denied that demography is not destiny. Well, I'm here to say that if demography is not destiny, it's surely a pretty large portion of it. And so we need to pay attention if we want to plot our own destiny responsibly and make sense of the constraints that we're under. Now, many of the demographic phenomena I'm going to talk about, the aging of populations, problems of youth bulge in the developing world, slowdown of population growth in Europe, have gotten a fair bit of attention separately as national problems. That is, European countries, of course, are worried about pensions, as we are in the U.S. Security experts are worried about the potential for recruiting terrorists among young and expanding populations in developing countries. These are all valid concerns. However, the paper I'm presenting today argues that seeing these trends in isolation as national or regional problems really misses the big picture. What matters is not so much the trends in any one country or several individual countries, important though they are. What matters even more, though, is how trends are moving in different directions in different countries, and the consequences that is going to have for the balance of growth, the balance of power, and the opportunities for global cooperation and conflict in the years to come. Now, the paper that I'm presenting was originally commissioned by the Mackinder Foundation, a foundation concerned with geography and security in the United Kingdom. I'm grateful to them for having sponsored this work. They sponsored also the initial presentation for an informal policy, a meeting of policy people in the UK. The paper was subsequently presented to the German Council on Foreign Relations last year in Berlin, and at a meeting that my colleague Eric Kaufmann organized in London. But I haven't had a chance really to talk about these issues to a policy audience in the United States. And I want to thank Jeff and the Wilson Center for giving me that opportunity today, and thank all of you for coming. Now, I don't know if you can follow the graphics. The print is not as bold as I'd like, and so I may have to ask you to get the paper and follow reading later. But the message is basically simple, and that is we've learned a lot over the last 20 years regarding how to think about population change and conflict. When I first started this research, people came to me and said, "Are you talking about that pressure cooker idea that the more people you have, the angrier they are and the more difficulty you're going to have with them?" And I answered no. I'm trying to refine this and say it doesn't matter necessarily how many people are in a given resource area or the kinds of people that are thrown together that are in a state. What matters is the ability of administrative organizations and flexible economies to be able to stably reproduce itself over time and channel the conflicts that potentially arise between different groups that are competing for positions and resources. If you have state, and in this case I'll argue international organizations and cooperation that are aware of and respond to the challenge of changing populations, you don't necessarily have to have conflict. However, if inflexible organizations and policy that is resistant to change comes up against a situation in which the numbers of people that are moving into areas, looking for jobs, seeking housing, trying to find mates, trying to build families, trying to find positions for their children, all of that is changing, but the resources of a society are not, then conflict becomes very likely. So political demography, as we see it, is not a matter of simple demographic determinism. Rather, it's a real policy challenge. Can you foresee the pressures that are going to arise from ongoing demographic changes? And can economic and administrative organizations respond effectively to those challenges? If so, you actually have the possibility of turning these trends to your advantage, of building successful, broader political and social structures that effectively assimilate and integrate populations. The difficulty, of course, is if we don't undertake that task, if we don't examine demographic trends and think about their consequences, we get the reverse of integration. Instead, we get groups becoming tight, focused identity groups fighting with each other in the struggle to get their space and get what they consider to be their fair share. Now, there are 6 global population trends that I'm going to highlight. I've given them catchy song titles, not for any particular reason. They're not particularly musical themes, but I'm hoping that maybe they will seem a little bit less like sheer numerical drudgery if we can capture them with a common phrase. One major issue is the growing scale of big emerging markets in the world economy. There's a lot of talk, of course, about globalization and the emergence of India and China, the additional 2 billion workers that those countries add to the global labor market and the global economy. That's a big part, but only a part of the picture that I want to discuss. Second trend, the great slowdown in population growth in high-income countries, particularly Japan and Eastern Europe and the European portions of the former Soviet Union, to a lesser degree in Southern Europe, and to some degree in all of the high-income countries. Fertility rates have gone down, and if fertility rates continue to decline, population growth will reverse, and population will decline as well. Third, migration from the third world to the first world. Of course, Muslim migration to Europe, Hispanic migration to the United States, increasingly migration from Southeast Asia and from Northeast Asia to Japan. All of these get highlighted as national problems, but they look a little different, I think, if we see them as truly global trends. Fourth, the aging of populations, again, particularly in high-income countries, but not only there. China is also one of the countries that is going to face a major shift to a more substantially elderly population. What are the consequences of having a large number of over 60 population for health, work, retirement? 2 trends that I probably won't have much time to get to in detail today, but are worth keeping in mind. First, the unexpected global spillovers, primarily of global pathogens. That is, disease has become a global, not a local concern. Whether we're talking about SARS, avian flu, HIV, epidemics that start in one part of the world almost inevitably become threats to the rest of the world. Dealing with issues of quarantine, migration, mobilization, resource allocation means that coping with these diseases, we don't know which one is going to come next or where it's going to come from, is inevitably a global security problem. And last, hyper-urbanization in the third world. Developing countries are not only growing fast in overall size, they are acquiring urban populations of a magnitude that were not seen in the developed world until well into their movement toward becoming industrialized societies. So what is it going to mean to have large numbers of cities of 10 million population or greater embedded in countries whose economies are still relatively low to middle income? So these are 6 trends. Each of them, I think, forms a major challenge to global security and needs to be thought about and approached in those terms. Let's get some numbers on the table just so we have some sense of what we're talking about. This table shows the largest countries of the world by population currently and 20 years from now. Now, there's not a lot of change in the rankings in the next 20 years, so don't look for sudden big movements or jumps by one particular country. Rather, what I'd like you to look at are simply the magnitude of the numbers. That is, China is going to grow by about 135 million people in the next 20 years. India, with a much higher growth rate still than China, is likely to add almost 300 million people. That is, India is going to add a population in the next 20 years equivalent to the entire United States today. But India is not the only country adding large numbers. The USA is also growing due to migration and relatively high birth rates among recent migrants. Indonesia also going to add about 140 million people. Brazil is going to add, you have to drop down a layer, about 40 million people. Pakistan is projected to grow by about 70 million people. All in all, even though the global rate of population growth has declined, the largest countries in the world are on track to add almost 1 billion people in the next few decades. About 500 million in the next 20 years, another billion in the 30 years after that. So, certainly, I hope, if I say, I don't know if 50 years is my lifetime anymore. I'm 53 now. I used to be able to talk 10 or 15 years ago about 50 years as being, I'll be here to see that. I don't know if that's true any longer. But many of you, and certainly my kids, are going to have to live in the world that will be here 45, 50 years from now. And that will be a world in which today's largest countries are really far larger than they are today. Now, the countries in green are highlighted in that color to indicate that they have large Muslim populations. India is not predominantly Muslim, but has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world nonetheless. Now, and what you see up there is quite a number of the world's largest countries are Muslim. Now, this isn't necessarily because they're fast growing. Indonesia has slowed down quite a bit, although Pakistan and Bangladesh, Nigeria are still growing rapidly. Egypt, Turkey, and Iran are also growing rapidly. Iran scheduled to, if current trends hold, Iran will gain 20 million people in the next 20 years. Turkey gain about 16 or 17 million. So these countries are growing fast. All I'm saying by pointing this out is that if today's current trend of hostility between Western and Muslim nations continues, that is, if we allow this clash of civilizations to deepen and fester, we are going to have a huge problem in the next 20, 30, 40 years because we're not talking about the Muslim world being a small place or being concentrated in out-of-the-way insignificant countries. If a generalized antipathy between Western and Muslim nations should take root and grow, we will be talking about a polarization that includes many of the largest and what I believe will be economically important countries in the next half century. Now, this is the list of fastest growing countries. Most of these fast growing countries are actually small in current population. Most of the large countries in the world have reduced their annual growth rate below 3% a year, which used to be kind of the high water mark for developing countries. But there's still quite a number of countries up here that have growth rates of 3% a year or more. and that means doubling roughly every generation. Now, a lot of these countries at the top of the list are, again, Muslim countries, and this mainly reflects low levels of female literacy and female autonomy in those countries. That is, culturally, Muslim countries have been among the least quick to move in the direction of greater education and empowerment of women, and we have found that one of the factors that's strongly associated with very high fertility and high birth rates is relatively low levels of education and autonomy for women in a society. So this is the main factor explaining that large number of Muslim states at the top. And again, the significance of this graph is if there are links between high rates of population growth and difficulties in the stable assimilation of a younger generation to existing political and social institutions, then these countries may become flashpoints for conflict in the future. These are the countries where very high rates of growth pose major challenges to the flexibility and absorptive character of economies and political systems. What does this look like geographically? It's quite striking, really. The countries in white on this map, and even though I know it's far away, I think most of you can get the gist of this. In former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, populations are stagnant or shrinking. In North America, Chile, Argentina, Australia, South Africa, and most of East Asia, populations are growing modestly. But in much of South America, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and South Asia, there's still very substantial rates of population growth. And so if, on the whole, global population growth has slowed, that's true. A lot of the population bomb anxieties about everybody standing on their shoulders or running out of food hasn't come to pass. Fortunately, global food supplies have grown, resources have proved fairly expandable, and population growth in many of the largest countries of the world has slowed down. But in terms of local possibilities for population growth to put a significant strain on the local concentrations of resources and the adaptability of institutions, there's still a belt of difficulty running from northern South America across Africa through the Middle East and South Asia. All right, that's population growth. Those are some big emerging markets there. That is India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey. These are all countries whose populations will be in the 100 million to billion range. What, by contrast, is going to be happening in Europe? Until very recently, we tend to forget this, but through most of the 19th and 20th century, fastest growing populations in the world were in the rapidly industrializing countries of Europe. It's no accident that in the 19th and 20th centuries, Europe sent millions and millions of migrants to people other countries in the rest of the world. Yes, America, Australia, Canada, Argentina. Many other countries received vast streams. Why? Because, having been introduced to industrialization and rapid economic growth, these countries were growing rapidly. Populations, in fact, were growing so rapidly that they outgrew the opportunities in the still largely agrarian economies of 19th century Europe. So Europe actually was a demographic heavyweight in the world for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. That era is now over. Europe has instead become a center of demographic stagnation, and it is absorbing immigrants from the more rapidly growing countries of the world. Now, in the next 20 years, most of what we see for European countries is mild growth to stability. That is, the next 20 years, the baby boomers are simply going to grow. They will grow older, a point I will come to in a minute, but they're not going to disappear. By 2050, however, those countries that really have seen a sharp decline in fertility, where women typically have decided, one child is enough for me, thank you, maybe two, but certainly not more than that, In those countries where fertility has fallen below replacement, so that fertility rates are about 1.7 and falling, by the middle of the century, we will start to see some marked population declines. The United Kingdom and France, who have been more open to immigration in recent years, will not have that decline. But Germany is projected to decline slightly, Italy more substantially, Poland quite a lot. And as we get down to the bottom of that list, if we look at Romania, Bulgaria, Russia, and the Ukraine, we see countries that are going to lose anywhere from a third to almost, in the case of Ukraine, almost half of their population if current trends hold. And I would have to say that I view those 2050 estimates as conservative. The reason I say that is these are based on the mid-level UN population projections, and those mid-level projections actually assume that current European demography is an aberration, that people don't want to have just 1 to 1.5 children per family, and that we could reasonably expect fertility rates in West European countries to rebound slightly in the next 40 years. Now, it's true that most of observed human history has seen populations with reproduction rates not fall below replacement for any length of time. Yet we may be seeing something like a third stage demographic revolution in Europe, where people have more or less, as a society or as a culture, accepted a norm of below replacement fertility. That is, people may simply have decided they would rather invest in a second car than a second child or a second home. In other words, if people are seeing children more as a consumer luxury than as a vital attribute of their life, then they're going to make choices in their selection of consumer luxuries, and children may simply fall a little farther down on the list. There is no evidence yet that European women are going to be increasing their fertility anytime soon. Now, recent research has shown that there's a pretty strong relationship between late employment of young women in Europe and delayed childbearing, which leads to smaller families. As many of you probably know, the European employment system has not been terribly flexible for placing new labor market entrants. That's one of the rigidities in the European system that people worry about. Well, one of the consequences of that rigidity is that when women find it takes a little longer before they get into the labor force, they wait a little longer before starting other stages of their adult life, including marriage and child rearing. So perhaps a more flexible labor system and a boost in earlier employment of women in Europe will come, and that will restore higher levels of fertility. I don't want to count on that. So I'm suggesting that Germany's population may fall a little further. Italy's may fall a little further. Spain's may decline substantially. These are at the least conservative estimates, and what they show is either no growth in the next 30 to 40 years for most countries in Europe, or some really major declines in the former Soviet Union countries that are having major problems with their health and economy. Another picture, pictures being more effective than numbers. Here's the weight of world population growth in the next few decades. The countries in purple are the largest countries in the world by population size. To be more accurate, those are the countries that are going to add the most to their populations in the next few decades. The rest of the world is in yellow. Now, what's really, and there's, if you can see it, Western Europe is painted there in gray. And what's really striking is the difference in anticipated growth. The EU 27 as a whole are expected to add only about 3 million people in the coming decades. In the same period, this is, I think, to 2025, just the next couple of decades. By contrast, the top 20 growing countries in population are going to add more than 1 billion. Now that's a huge difference. If you're talking about where are the leading edges of economic growth going to be, where are markets growing fast, where are large numbers of young people the source of energy and new ideas, where are they going to be concentrated, what are going to be the centers of massive expansion in populations in terms of energy, economic growth, and so on, it's going to be in those countries marked in purple, in China, India, Brazil, the US, Mexico, perhaps even Congo, Indonesia, but Europe is going to be left out. Now, this is why I say one has to look at these things globally. Europe, viewed by itself, has a pension and aging problem. Other parts of the world have an assimilation and absorption problem. How can they absorb these large growing numbers? Together, Europe and the high-income countries and the fast-growing countries make a very good match. Europe and Japan have the capital to invest, the know-how to pioneer technologies for rapid growth. Other countries will have the markets and the laborers to create the demand and the labor supply to fuel that growth. So all they have to do is get together. But doing that, of course, requires getting past the idea of national growth and national goals. One needs to start to think of the globe as a system of integrated opportunities. Now, youngest countries. How young are the young countries going to be? Well, African countries lead the list. These are the youngest countries in the world today. Look in particular at the percentage of population over age 60. As a percentage, it is almost negligible. Look at the percentage under age 14. It is about half of the population. Now, that's fine. That's not a bad thing. I mean, young people are good. I was young once. I enjoyed it. I have kids. I hope they flourish. Young people are our greatest resource if they are educated, socialized, and employed. On the other hand, if they're snatched by guerrillas and drilled as child soldiers, then they become walking time bombs and human disasters. So there's clearly an issue here, a lot of raw material for good or bad ends in many African countries. Now, compare now the age structure of the oldest countries looking both today and 45 years ahead. Today, the oldest countries already have a percentage of their population over 60 that is 8 to 10 times that of the younger countries. Now, that's a considerable burden to carry if you're going to retire those people and pension them off in the style to which they've become accustomed. There's a lot less potential young labor in those countries than there is in the African countries that I just showed you. In fact, the under 14 population, if you do the arithmetic there, is about 15%, only about one-third the proportion in the truly young countries. So there's a major difference in age structure here. Now, looking ahead 45 years, by current trends, what happens when the baby boomers get old? Well, we thought the baby boomers would have fun. Sexual revolution, lots of kids. Well, it coincided with women's liberation and the advent of widespread inexpensive birth control. So the baby boomers are having fun and not reproducing. They're just aging. And the result of that is that as they become a larger percent of their national populations, they're not leaving many children to take up the challenges of the future. Instead, those aging baby boomers, by 2050, they will be anywhere from 30 to 40% of total population. Now think about that for a minute. When you put yourself in a society where 40% of the entire population is over age 60, well, they're obviously not all going to retire, partly because a lot of them don't want to. And thank goodness they'll be healthy enough and energetic enough to continue working. The downside of that, though, is that maintaining the vitality of an elderly population is exceedingly expensive. It would be great if we can make heart transplants, arterial stents, and hip replacements available to everybody who wants them to keep the elderly population active, energetic, and in the workforce. But that's not nearly as cost effective as having a younger, healthier workforce take those jobs. And frankly, a lot of people who have worked hard all their lives are looking forward to retirement or at least changing careers. They may want to move out from behind heavy machinery and get behind a desk for a while or do something that allows them to travel. Simply locking people into their current jobs for an extra 5 or 10 or 15 years is not going to be a reasonable solution to dealing with a population where fully 40% are 60 or older. One wants to hope for a shift in the age structure or a shift in economic opportunities. One of the things I'm going to suggest that I realize is almost absurd, but which I think needs to get serious thought, is how can one seriously reduce the cost of providing a healthy and satisfactory retirement to people who are over age 60 from Japan, from Europe, from North America. I think it would be great if they could retire to countries where it's much cheaper to provide the labor-intensive care and medicine that they require. My parents' generation, a lot of people retired to Florida or to Palm Springs. In the future, I think it would be great if people could migrate to Latin America. They've started doing it moving to Costa Rica to retire. Europeans are buying retirement homes in Spain. The real frontier, though, is Northern Africa. Ideally, many of the young third world health professionals that can't find reasonable employment in their own country and are migrating to Europe could be induced to stay if the West got serious about building high-quality retirement and medical facilities to care for the elderly population in countries that have a relatively large, relatively less costly, but reasonably well-trained labor force. It's a win-win for everyone. The problem is we have a lot to overcome in the way of trust between populations of the wealthier countries and developing countries. But if we can overcome that mistrust and build on that complementarity, we have a need, they have resources, there's a win-win there for everyone. But this problem in 2050 of a population largely over age 60, yes, part of it is providing for people's pensions, but part of it is also simply how do we deliver the resources to give people the healthy and satisfying retirement they want, and how do we resupply the energy and the innovation that economies are going to require and that they normally get from bringing new cohorts of youth into the labor force. Now, I can't read the print on this myself. This is a graphic that, again, looks at the age structures. And again, you see the countries in blue are growing older. And this includes China, includes Ukraine. It's especially severe for Japan, Russia, Australia, Canada. And then the countries in red and pink are the ones that are young. What we see in this graph is that different portions of the world are creating age structures that are almost pathological internally. Frankly, a youth structure with 40% of the population 12 years old or younger is a difficult population to handle. So many kids needing schooling, depending on parents, needing to be socialized and integrated, needing jobs when they grow older. That's a difficult age structure to handle. It's also difficult to handle an age structure where 30 or 40% of the population is elderly. Either way, there's a very heavy burden on the population of prime working years in the middle range. But if you put these together, that is, if you put some of these younger populations together with the older populations, together they again form a fairly balanced age structure. Now, these are almost gravitational forces. That is, you have imbalances in age and labor market structures in these countries. And so what's happening? There's a natural flow of young people from the developing world to the industrialized world. It is a problem because they have different cultures, different expectations, and frankly, because countries in the developing world are not certain how to respond. There's a lot of ambiguity. Do we welcome migrants from the developing world, but only as long as they embrace our culture and ways of doing things? How far can we go in accepting differences in the way people act while still expecting them to integrate into our society? Now, the United States made a very strong commitment in the 19th century to say we are going to accept people and we're going to expect them to follow our laws and learn our languages. It was anybody is welcome, give us your poor huddled masses, but we expect the poor huddled masses to send their kids to our public schools, and we hope that someday they'll aspire to citizenship and we have an open policy. In the United States, I think the bottom line on most econometric studies is that the United States has actually benefited quite considerably from a relatively open door policy. We've had to close the door a bit because the United States no longer has as much open land as it did in the 19th century. But we may have closed it too far now, and there's serious worry about whether the United States has begun to choke off a vital stream of engineering and scientific talent from developing countries. Why have we tried to do this? Well, one reason is there's some anxiety that we are being overrun by non-Americans, particularly from south of the border. Why closing off the supply of Swedish botanists solves this problem is beyond me, but it is one of the consequences of a more restrictive migration policy. Terrorism, of course, is also an issue, despite the fact that all the evidence shows that the terrorists who have attacked the United States, most of them entered the country on legal visas and simply overstayed the visas or engaged in activity that we would not expect from people who entered the country legally. But the source of terror was not illegal migrants sneaking across the border in dark of night. So we seem to have, in my view, a major misfit between policies that are adopted for ostensibly the purposes of providing greater security in this country, but in effect have the consequence of locking in an unstable, unbalanced age structure and reducing the flow of skilled people and youthful energy that the country actually seems to be willing to absorb. Most of the illegal migrants in this country come here to work and work. Otherwise, they wouldn't be coming. Europe and Japan, similar issues, and again, the problems of half-hearted assimilation and migration with restricted tolerance and unclear commitment has proven to be a recipe for precisely the type of ambiguity over identity and assimilation that has bred terrorism, homegrown terrorism, and in some places, plain old homegrown grumpy violence of the same kind that American cities are familiar with, from having taken the same kind of half-hearted integration attitude toward African Americans. American cities, of course, said to the South, send us your African American workers. We need the labor to build our cities. But the school systems also said, we don't quite want to accept them on the same basis into all of our school systems, and the residential housing market said we want to make sure that they're in restricted areas. And it was precisely those disjunctions that led to the accumulation of grievances and the type of eruptions of violence that Los Angeles saw with the Rodney King riots and that France has now seen with the Parisian suburb riots. It's very hard to do immigration halfway. The problem of urban agglomeration is also growing throughout the world. The largest cities in the world 10 years from now will not be London and New York and Los Angeles. They will be Tokyo, Mumbai, Delhi, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo. Jakarta, Lagos, Kolkata, Karachi, Cairo, Rio. These are the urban super cities of the future. Now, cities have traditionally been hubs of communication, and they've been engines of economic growth. We don't quite know what will happen when these supersized cities develop in countries that are in the relatively early stages still of building up their industrial economies, dealing with pollution problems, dealing with public health problems, and so on. So this is kind of a new experiment. But what we do know is that rural to urban migration is often just the first leg in a migration journey that then leads to international migration. So it does seem certain that as larger and larger numbers of people uproot from the countryside and relocate to the cities, that they become more fluid in general. They may be more willing to move for work in the future, or their children may be more willing to work abroad. And I think that's a good thing. Flexibility of labor markets has generally been good. But it's unlikely that the possible transmission of people, terrorists, and diseases will be anything but multiplied when we have urban centers of 10 million and more doubling and tripling in number throughout the world. The projection, even for Africa, which is kind of last to the party in terms of urbanization, is that populations will be 40 to 50, in some cases 60% urban. Not as much as Europe, but large parts of Africa will be as heavily urbanized in 2030 as much of Europe was around 1950. Will they be as economically advanced as Europe was around 1950, allowing even for the damage of World War II? Probably not. How are they going to support those urban populations and satisfy them? That's going to be a major challenge for the future. I'm happy to talk about the sources for the data if you wish. As I say, most of this is derived open source, UN, moderate projection data. What's important, however, I think, are the degree to which the trends we're seeing in population growth in different portions of the world provide the potential for a complementarity or for a severe clash. If the richer countries of the world pull up the drawbridges, decide that they want to be safe and comfortable like Switzerland, surrounded, if they can be, by mountains that keep outsiders out while preserving the character of their pristine valleys, they are going to create a problem of stagnation and senior dependency for themselves. But they are also going to create a quite substantial problem by choking off the best opportunities for the countries on their borders with large, youthful, growing populations. They're going to be seeking work and seeking opportunities. It's also going to be the case that the richest areas for investment for Europe and Japan are going to be in the very fast-growing markets in South Asia, East Asia, even, yes, sub-Saharan Africa. There are cell phone billionaires who have made fortunes catering to the large number of consumers, very low-income consumers, low-income consumers, but still very large numbers of them that are creating markets for basic services and commodities in Africa. So if Europeans are going to keep their economy growing, even as their population stagnates, they really have no alternative but to seek greater investment in the developing world. But how can you invest in a world with which you do not have good relationships, with which you do not have binding agreements or stable legal agreements? I mention this now in particular with regard to the debate on the admission of Turkey to the European Union, which I think is in many ways is a key test of how the world is going to respond to all the challenges I've laid out here today. Turkey is a excuse me. Turkey is a large and rapidly growing and relatively youthful population, certainly compared to most of the countries of Europe. It is in many ways an ideal partner for a Europe that is rich in capital, stagnating in labor, and in need of everything for manpower, for armed intervention, for stability forces in the third world, to youthful consumers, to new idea creators. And in fact, Europe has already, in many countries, opened their arms to Turkish migrants to serve their labor needs. But there's talk now of saying, enough. Sarkozy, the presidential candidate in France, Minister Sarkozy said, Turkey is not part of Europe. It's not conceivable that they should be allowed to join the EU. Well, whether or not Turkey is or is not part of Europe seems to me very much not a matter of geography, but a matter for Europeans to decide. After all, the Roman Empire was a European creation, but Morocco, Tunis, and Algiers were part of the Roman Empire at a time when Scotland and Germany were simply foreign, empty backwater spaces. Now, who's to say that the integration of North Africa into Europe should not be a good thing again? Do we want to say, well, they were conquered by the Ottoman Empire 500 years ago, so they're lost to Europe forever? Too bad. With all their people, all their history, and all their resources. This is the type of thinking that I fear is going to fall afoul of demographic reality. The natural partnership in the age distribution, in rates of population growth on the one hand, and an aging population and high opportunities for capital and labor north of the Mediterranean create natural opportunities if the severe political and religious differences can be overcome. Is there a challenge there? Yes. But is there a huge opportunity? Is there a natural balancing that's called for by the demographic realities? I think that's a big opportunity, a big challenge, but the best hope for Europe, Japan, and the United States for the next 50 and 100 years is to embrace globalization, integrate with the world, and accept the goal of helping all populations, and not just their own, maximize their development. Why? Because if they do that, I'm afraid even the populations of the rich countries trying to look out for themselves are going to fall short of getting the kind of world that they want to live in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jack. Why don't we turn straight to Eric, and then we'll go to discussion.
Hi. I just want to thank Jeff and the Wilson Center for inviting me here. I've been very impressed the last few days at the vibrancy of the policy, the links between academia and the policy community. It seems like a very vibrant intellectual environment, so I'm quite impressed by that. Now, like Jack, I'm a political scientist with an interest in demographic issues. One of the differences is that I specialize more in nationalism and ethnic conflict, so looking more within states perhaps than between states, although some of the issues do cross national borders, and particularly the issue that Jeff mentioned about differential population growth between ethnic groups, between religious groups. You may or may not be aware that about 95% of the world's states are multi-ethnic. And in fact, I think about 40% of the world's states have no ethnic majority group. So this is kind of a norm, a multi-ethnic states. What happens when one group starts to grow faster than another? When Catholics in Northern Ireland grow faster than Protestants? And I recently did a book on unionism in Northern Ireland, and the unionist Prime Minister Terence O'Neill, even back in the 1960s, put it very clearly. He said, the great fear of the Protestant population of Northern Ireland is that they will be outbred. It's as simple as that. And in fact, even though we hear about the peace process and all these political events, underneath it all is this fear, and is as strong today as it ever was within the Protestant community, of losing the demographic race. And this kind of feeds into wider issues of demographics and politics, namely the post-1989 so-called third wave of democratization, in which democracies have been introduced to parts of the world that have not generally been democratic. What's happened often is politics has gone on communal lines, religious or ethnic, as we see perhaps in Iraq or Lebanon. What that means is, if winning an election is simply about getting out your ethnic vote, numbers matter. And if you're growing faster than the other guys, you're going to win the election. So quite clearly, democratization makes demography more important. That's one of the important trends, I think, of our period, and will only become more important. But anyhow, I'm going to turn now to Jack's paper, which it's quite a tall order to try and pick holes in Jack's magisterial work. Jeff asked me to do two things. One is to try and provide a European perspective. Obviously, I'm not European, but I have lived and worked there for about 14 years. and also a view perhaps from the perspective of students of nationalism and ethnic conflict. And as I say, it's a daunting challenge because Jack is kind of a founding figure in the field of political demography, and he's integrated in this paper a number of different methodologies that he's worked on in the past, including political history as well as large-scale quantitative analysis. So he's brought it together to provide, I think, a very concise, well-presented list of some of the major demographic forces that will shape the coming half-century. Well, I agree with so much of the paper. I just want to focus on a few areas where I think there might be areas to contest, particularly for those coming from a European perspective. And I think I will be reflecting what is kind of the mainstream European centrist policy perspective on this, particularly in points 3 and 4 regarding migration to Europe and also the relationship between population aging and a number of other issues of demography. Okay, so first of all, I want to start out by saying where I certainly think Jack's made a lot of important points. First of all, with regard to flexibility of European labor markets, I think European leaders increasingly understand, particularly in continental Europe, that they need to make better use of their young and ethnic minority populations within the labor market. They understand the need to move workers out of the old industrial sectors into the sunrise industries. So I think that's absolutely a sensible solution. But at the same time, I also think there's this very strong will to preserve the universality of the European welfare state, and I don't see that changing substantially. So there may be tweaking with the welfare state, there may be attempts to involve some the private sector or perhaps even to subcontract, but there will still be political will to maintain universal social provision, even in areas like housing. So I don't see that really changing. But within that constraint, I think an attempt to be more flexible. Jack's incredibly innovative idea about retirement to the south shore of the Mediterranean, to the developing world, I think is an excellent idea, and I do think it'll increasingly take place. I myself have holidayed from Europe to Tunisia, Morocco, and Cuba as well, and I think the Cuban model of medical tourism has fascinated me, and I think it is a model for the future whereby countries that can produce a lot of doctors and have low-cost medical care will see a lot of tourists coming in to make use of that medical care. And similarly with retirement, I can't see why Tunisia, extremely pleasant country, wouldn't be a perfect retirement area, and there's already cheap flights with Ryanair and various others. And also Jack's point, which wasn't mentioned here, about European countries with few young people turning to foreign soldiers to project hard power on the ground. I think another sensible point, which we can already see elements or glimmers of it with the Gurkhas, the Nepalese regiments and the British forces. I think perhaps Britain and France will utilize soldiers from their ex-colonies because of the linguistic and historical links. But I do want to come to now the more contentious point of north-south migration, and of course immigration is a real hot-button issue. And I know this, in my own family, my grandparents escaped the Holocaust on my father's side, and I've also got Latin American, Asian roots as well. So it's certainly an emotive issue for a lot of people. Can be seen through very sort of normative eyes, but I still think the issue has to be approached contextually. I think in this case, when we're talking about immigration from particularly North Africa to Europe, I don't see some of the trends. I don't think that the European leaders will follow some of these prescriptions for particularly large-scale migration, and I'll come to some of the reasons why I think that is. But before I get to that, I want to draw attention perhaps to one point which maybe wasn't brought out, I thought, forcefully enough, and that is the distinction between population aging and population decline. And this is a very kind of demographer's point, and I think the distinction is elided a little bit in the paper, and that is that you can have a population that has been declining for hundreds of years that is perfectly stable in terms of age structure. That is, it won't be a particularly old population. And the reason for this is simply that the reason that there's an aging problem in in Europe is partly because you've had a change in the fertility rate. So you had a baby boom and then you had a baby bust in the 1960s, creating a kind of hump, a kind of pig in the python, if you like, the sort of metaphor of a snake that's just eaten something very large. But that bump is going to move through the snake and eventually die off, leaving, once again, a stable age structure and correcting automatically the aging problem. It will not, what it won't do is correct the problem of population decline. But I thought it was important to make that point because the impression was given that, by 2050 a lot of Europe will have 40% of the population over 60, and that maybe in 2100 it might be 90%. Well, actually not. Actually, it'll probably be back, it'll probably come closer to 20% again, or even below that. So there's kind of a phenomenon where, as demographers say, populations forget their own pasts, and so I think that has to be borne in mind. Secondly, Europe has faced periods of different age structures in the past. It has had, after the Second World War, a baby boom in which there were a lot of 0 to 14-year-olds, which arguably are a bigger drain on a state than 60-plus population. So, again, this perhaps, I think, slightly alarmist view of a large 60-plus population, I think, will and is being questioned in some circles. Now, the other issue, of course, concerns the impact of immigration. And it's clear that immigration does raise GDP. It's good for an economy. However, I think the question that a lot of Europeans will be looking to is, what is the impact on GDP per capita? That is, will immigration raise income per head, or will it simply raise aggregate GDP? And I think for a lot of European countries, they aren't really that concerned about total GDP. It's more GDP per capita. And of course, that then depends on skill levels of the immigrants, the degree to which they use state services, the degree to which they integrate with low cost, etc. And that's far from clear from the existing evidence. Now, population decline, though, that still remains an issue. How do you deal with the fact that, were it not for immigration, European populations would already be declining? But here I think one can perhaps be a bit more optimistic. If you look at France, if you look at some Scandinavian countries, they have achieved pretty close, if not to population replacement period fertility rates. France, I saw in a recent article, has achieved about a 2.1 total fertility rate. Now, these rates kind of bounce up and down a little bit, but one of the policy tools that seems to be effective is providing is publicly provided daycare and flexible working arrangements, which can allow women to combine careers with raising children a bit earlier and make the cost of that less. Whereas in Southern Europe, where you don't have flexible working arrangements, women are kind of forced to choose, if you like, career or kids, and there you really see a fall off in the. So I think there are some. There is the emergence, perhaps, of some kind of a model for public policy to move towards to correct the population decline problem, and that can be addressed. It doesn't have to be addressed soon. It can be addressed, in the long durée rather than quickly. But still, I mean, immigration certainly would make it easier. Would certainly ease the path, smooth out this dramatic aging of the population in Europe. So why wouldn't European countries go for it? And I think here's where perhaps my perspective focusing on ethnic conflicts and national identities is a bit different. I think I'm quite sensitive to the history of ethnic conflict, the history of national identity, and how difficult it is to assimilate immigrants or assimilate different ethnic groups under certain circumstances. That's not to say it hasn't been done. I mean, if you look at Europe, certain countries such as Hungary, Turkey, if we can consider Turkey a European country, these countries, the majority of or the largest segment of the ethnic majority are actually made up of people who've actually assimilated into the dominant ethnic group. So if you take the year 1770 in Hungary, only about 35% of the population of Hungary was Magyar. And over the next 2 centuries, large numbers of Slovaks and Ruthenians and Jews and others became Hungarian. Literally, they actually lost their old identities, assimilated completely, and changed their myths of ancestry. So they literally became Hungarians. And even in France and Italy, basically France and Italy were hodgepodges of different dialect areas, and they really had to work at assimilating those people, making Italians. And that was a project that took about 100 years, but it has been quite successful. So there has been a lot of assimilation, and there has been immigration too, not on the same scale as in the United States, but Britain has assimilated Huguenots in large numbers in the 17th century. Irish and Jews in the 19th century, not all were assimilated, but large numbers. Austria has assimilated Slavs throughout the period of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. France has assimilated many Polish, Spanish, Italian, Switzerland similarly. So there has been this process of assimilating at least European immigrants. Now, why not non-European immigrants? Well, what is the record? If we look at Europe today, what we see are two distinct paths. We see black and East Asian Europeans effectively intermarrying and assimilating in large numbers. But we see that immigrants from the Islamic countries, which Jack mentions, effectively having extremely low levels of intermarriage with the native population, very high rates of religious retention. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why European countries are more reluctant to pursue a sort of larger scale immigration policy. If we look, for example, at if we look at Britain and we look at intermarriage, well, one of the recent facts I think that was announced from the 2001 UK census was that there are more children with one black parent and one white parent in England than with two black parents. The intermarriage rate then between Afro-Caribbean immigrants, Afro-Caribbean population and the native English population is extremely high. However, if you look at the Bangladeshi and Pakistani Muslim population in the UK, the intermarriage rate is less than 5%. If we also look at religious retention, there's, in fact, younger Muslims in the UK are more religious than those over 55. In contrast, once again, to Afro-Caribbeans, granted Afro-Caribbeans come from a Christian background, but the degree of secularism within the Afro-Caribbean population increases markedly in the second generation. There's no increase in the second generation amongst Muslims. A similar pattern in Holland, those from the Dutch Antilles and Guyana, high intermarriage rates, quick conversion to the local culture. Turkish and Moroccan Muslim, very slow convergence, very strong retention of the religion. And if we look historically, it's a fact that religion has often played a role in maintaining diaspora, maintaining ethnic boundaries. Now, given this, what we've also seen is patterns of riots, urban ethnic riots have shifted, whereas once it was mainly black-white rioting, it's now mainly riots between Muslims and Christians. Again, a shift in patterns, but indicative, I think, of some of the difficulties which Europe's having with integration of Islamic immigrants. And I'm not sure that this is simply a matter of the Europeans changing their policies vis-a-vis the Islamic immigrant. I think that some of this has to be down to cultural differences, say, between Afro-Caribbeans who seem to have a high rate of assimilation and Muslim groups which seem to have a low rate of assimilation. Now, it's true that Muslims are a very small percentage of the West European population, only about 3%. They're set to be about, on current trends, about 10 to 15% by 2050. Still not a large percentage, but within particular areas, like if we think of Rotterdam or we think of Leicester in England or Birmingham, you're going to have areas in which there will be more of a political challenge from a large Muslim population. Now, all of this has been factored into the decisions of the political class in continental Europe and also in the UK. And I think that the current discourse on immigration reflects that. And there is, I think, a limited then willingness to look to south of the southern Mediterranean as a source of immigration. What I do see happening, though, is a continued flow from the post-2004 EU accession states, Eastern Europe. The so-called Polish plumber phenomenon will continue. Will definitely continue. So there will be immigration, but I think it'll be more Eastern European states who, and of course they can ill afford it, as Jack showed. Their populations are declining, and I think this flow will exacerbate that problem even more. Let's see, how much time have I got? not much, I suppose. But I'll just now that's just a little point that I wanted to make about the paper. But really, I want to shift gears here now to focus on a point Jack made, which I think is extremely important, and I want to talk about a little more, which is the political impact of rural to urban migration. I want to if we look at the historical record, not only is large-scale urbanization associated with some of the economic instability that Jack mentioned, it's also associated with major cultural upheavals and populist politics. If we look at Europe, the United States, at the turn of the 20th century, and even in the United States, if you look at the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1910s and 20s, which was a phenomenon driven by the influx of white Protestants from in a predominantly rural nation to the cities, encountering the diversity of the cities. Likewise, in Europe, you had a large-scale movement from the countryside to the city. That was linked to militaristic nationalism in Germany. And even in Britain, even though not linked perhaps to militaristic nationalism, it was linked to religious fundamentalism. For example, in Scotland, the migration from the Scottish Highlands to the lowlands in the 19th century was linked to firebrand preachers whipping up people, anti-Catholicism. All of these movements drew upon this rural to urban migration. Why is that the case? It's because people in rural settings see their nation through the prism of their village, which they see as sort of egalitarian, traditional, morally upright, and it's a context they can understand. They then come to the city, which is diverse, unequal, a cacophony. They're treated as second class. And the disjunction, the dissonance between the mental image they have in their mind, which is the village, and the environment that they encounter in the city makes them alienated and makes them susceptible to fundamentalist religious and ethnic appeals. So I think that is definitely one to watch. And Jack, even though Jack mentioned the biggest cities, there's also going to be a lot of small multi-million cities in places like China and India. I can't remember how many cities there are over 3 or 4 million in China, but it's, I think it's in the 20s or 10s or 20s. And even today, if we look at Islamist politics in a place like Iran, I mean, Ahmadinejad and his rural base, again, it's this village mentality colliding with the modern city and the disjuncture between that, which seems to be tinder for the fire of fundamentalism. So really, just to conclude, then, it seems that, and from what Jack said and from what I see, demographic conditions today really are setting the stage for a series of cultural and political upheavals, and I can't see the trend going the other way. Maybe it's just the pessimism of an academic, but thanks very much.
Well, thank you both, gentlemen. You've given us an awful lot to think about, try to internalize, and then try to come back to you with some questions and some thoughts. We have, as I said, microphones for facilitating the discussion. Why don't we start with Howard at the back of the room, and then we'll kind of bounce back and forth. So, Howard Wiarda.
Howard Wiarda from CSIS. My question is to Jack, and I guess it relates to the commentary on your paper. And that is, do we have a good way, as political scientists and sociologists, to measure nationalism and the intensity of nationalism and the ambition for great power status? And there are two anecdotes that I'll just briefly offer, which you might then use concretely to comment on. Back in the 1970s, for example, there was widespread sense among the population agencies that population was a global problem. And research that we did indicated that there were all kinds of national issues involved that the population agencies really didn't want to talk about in terms of their global campaigns to limit family size. And we kept arguing that, look, you have to take into account that Brazil is a rival of Argentina, and you have Colombia and Venezuela, and you have El Salvador and Honduras and other kinds of pairs, all of whom have power status with regard, or ambitions with regard to their neighbors. The second anecdote has to do with a recent trip to India on my part, where I found that, and it tracks with your data in Table 1 about India catching up with China. The Indians have this notion that in the year 2041, they will surpass China in terms of population. And I can assure you there will be an immense national celebration in India if and when that occurs on nationalistic grounds, since, after all, in part, national power is measured by population size, and we now understand that China, perhaps in part to counter that, is easing up a bit on its one-child per family policy. So what we have is population also intensely driven by nationalism, and I'm wondering if you should build that into your projections, and as a variable ought to take that more into account in terms of the policy prescriptions that you're also offering.
Sure. Jack, before you answer that, we had a lot of questions, so I'll get a couple, 2 or 3 at a time. So just pass that to John right there, Sean. Then we'll
Jack, I thought that was a very lucid presentation. I think it might be strengthened if my understanding is correct, that there's already a lot of what I will call south-south migration, even though that's nominal rather than directional, and a lot of south-south trade. And one can conceive, as long as the world economy stays open and all sorts of other assumptions, that will take some of the pressure off the Old North, because already people are moving for economic reasons, and a fast-growing China and a fast-growing India will suck up a lot of people and a lot of trade, which would give you quite a different picture by 2040. And it would be interesting, as we don't know what will happen, of course, to factor that in. Second is, I hope you publish this thing as fast as possible with the colored chart for those of us who are chronologically advantaged.
Right. Could you give it to the gentleman there? We'll do those 3, then we'll do this side of the table.
John Fino, Research Triangle Institute. Great presentation. I just wanted, pardon me if this is a tad technical, but on the chart that had the cities that are projected to grow to 15 million, 10 million, et cetera, I'm just curious if there was any sensitivity to the current growth rates of those cities. I mention that because, for instance, Rio de Janeiro is not growing at all. In fact, migrants are not going to Rio de Janeiro. They're going to other Brazilian cities. So I was wondering if it was just simply a calculation of, okay, this city is 7 million now and therefore will proportionally grow with the country, or if it was done specifically to look at the particular growth rates within those cities.
Jack, why don't we try to start with those?
Okay. The last one, basically, those are historic growth rates, and so they're very capable of being changed as migration flows change. I remember Mexico City was also projected to be much larger today than it actually is. This raises the point of the south-to-south migration, and you're absolutely right. I mean, a huge amount of economic development, internal trade, and migration is going on outside the developed world. That's fine if you look at migration as a threat or a pressure, but it's terrible if you look at it as a resource. That is, if there are young, ambitious people who want to acquire an engineering degree or want to acquire nursing or medical skills, and they're saying, where can I take these skills? You want those people to come to Europe, not all of them to go to Saudi Arabia or China. If Europe gets left out of that huge, rapidly growing south-south trade and migration, it's going to make it hard for Europe to keep its standard of living growing. However, the point that Howard raised and that Eric raised as well, sure, the biggest obstacle to taking advantage of the complementary changes in global population structure is nationalism. It is the idea that national communities have a special character or culture that is damaged when people who don't share those values enter the community and create a potential disruption. Now, is nationalism a real problem? It's a huge problem. It's one of the biggest issues in the world today. It's what tore up the Balkans. It's what's tearing up Lebanon. It is creating havoc in Africa. Is it an inevitable fact of social life that we have to compromise and accommodate to? There, I think, we should view it as a problem that needs to be overcome. I view nationalism somewhat like slavery. For a long time, people saw slavery as a natural, inevitable character of the differences among people. And the idea that everybody should be free and that no one should be a slave to anyone else, well, you couldn't have the world function that way. You know, who would pick up the garbage? Who would do the cooking? I mean, for a while, we said women will be slaves. And we kind of substituted that for a while. But I think we're starting to outgrow that as well and realize that women have a lot more to contribute. I view nationalism somewhat the same way. As long as people view their personal welfare as depending more on the community into which they are born and raised than on their own particular effort and skills and experience that they've acquired, it's going to be very problematic to create the kind of mobility of labor that the existing world demography seems to demand. Now, it's not going to go away quickly. You can't wave a wand and tell people, don't worry, someday you'll all be cosmopolitans and it won't matter. But I do think one has to think about how does one reduce the impact that nationalist allegiance and communal identity actually has on people's living standards. Now, one could say, you know, the way Europe is to deal with this threat is to try and fence it out. You know, it's too much to deal with. It's too disruptive. We have as many Muslim immigrants as we can handle. It's going to take a generation to assimilate them. Maybe then we can have more migration. But I view a country like Morocco, and I say, okay, what's the future of Morocco and its population going to be vis-a-vis Europe? Well, it's a potential threat of terrorist cells and angry migrants, or it's a potential source of productive relationships, resources, and people. Now, which outcome is more likely to provide the positive outcome? If Europeans say, for example, to Morocco or Algeria or Turkey, we're happy to trade with you, but you'll never be part of the European Union. You're Muslim countries. You're not European countries. That reinforces the kind of sense of where do we look for leadership, where do we look for hope, where do we look for models of behavior? Well, not to the Europeans they were not part of them. And they start looking to models in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, if you offer Morocco or Tunisia or Turkey the opportunity to say, you know, someday, in real time, 10 to 20 years, you could be a member of the EU, then you give people a very hopeful goal. I mean, I think, for example, let's say we solve the Palestinian-Israeli problem. Is al-Qaeda going to go away? No. They want their caliphate. They're still going to come after us. But are they going to be able to recruit more easily in a Morocco where many people are focused on the possibility of greater integration with the EU? Or are they going to have a harder time recruiting if Morocco is essentially told, sorry, you have no future as a part of Europe, you're going to be outsiders forever? It's going to be much easier for them to recruit. So I think Europe's own long-term interest, and yes, it's an enormous challenge, it's enormously difficult, history is full of problems with this, but I do think someday nationalism will be seen as a parochial relic of a pre-truly civilized era. Now, do we say, well, that's for our grandkids to worry about making that happen? Okay, not unreasonable. There's a lot of discouraging evidence out there, and Eric's an expert on all the places where it's gone wrong. But I think we have to be like those brave people who raised their voices against slavery and said slavery is unnatural. It's not natural. And I would go as far as to say fierce nationalist identity, as opposed to a kind of, you know, comfortable ethnic patriotism, but fierce national identity really is unnatural. It's something that's been created by and for the benefit of elites to foster their power. It's not to the benefit of ordinary people. And the more we can start working to kind of diminish the devils of nationalism, the better off more people will be. Is it going to be tough, Howard? You know that better than I. I have friends who are studying the conflict between Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. I've got people working for me on studies of what happened in Uganda, what's going on now in Lebanon. And in all of these cases, the story is people have been scared into thinking that their only salvation is arming their group to defend themselves and to beat others. But there's no exit from that strategy in that direction. The only exit from that problem is to try and make people as individuals feel they have more control of their destiny as individuals than as members of groups.
Terrific. Why don't we work down this side of that aisle? So, Sean, yep, please.
My name is George Pick. I am an independent scholar, and I have two observations or 2 points I want to make. To Professor Goldstone, I think your idea about lowering or bringing the health care into these up-and-coming countries, such as Mexico and South America, is an excellent idea. But I like to bring up a policy question. Is it possible to increase or extend Medicare to these countries? Because Medicare, being a real cornerstone of our upcoming crisis, if we could lower the cost of Medicare with this, I think we could solve our crisis, our catastrophic healthcare crisis. That's one point. The other point I have is for Dr. Kaufmann. I like to point out that your historical analysis for Hungary is somewhat incorrect. Hungary until 1919 was a very, very heterogeneous country with no assimilation between minority groups. When the Trianon Treaty came, they solved the problem by chopping up Hungary, and 2/3 of the area with the minority groups went to Romania, Czechoslovakia, etc. That's how they solved the problem. I want to also point out that today assimilation is a problem, a new problem for Hungary, and that's the gypsy minority, which has the highest rate of increase. Is almost 10% of the population, and it's not very integrated, and it is a real great problem. Thank you.
Okay. If you could pass it right over to Al, and we'll just work away, and I see a gentleman in the back.
Hi, thank you to both of you. It's a real change from our work over at USAID. I'm Al Bartlett. I'm Senior Advisor for Child Health over at the AID and the Global Health Bureau. For Jack, the one question that was in my mind as you spoke about the model of Europe and Japan, the aging societies with capital to invest, exporting capital and technology to the developing countries and developing economies, made me wonder what happened to the issue of globalization. And since you're framing your issue in terms of governance, one of the real issues around that exporting of technology and capital has been that those who export it actually, in many cases, are stronger than the governments in the countries where they work. So it just poses a challenge for government that I wonder if you could address. And I also wondered if you saw it from a historical perspective, sort of like the opening of the New South, where jobs were exported to the South with labor-busting laws and cheap labor and a lot of concessions by government to essentially develop an industrial base, which then ultimately evolved into something that was more appropriately democratic, I suppose. So just your thoughts on where does the issues that the people who used to demonstrate about globalization and are probably now demonstrating against the war, a little bit more acute problem, we're concerned about and we still probably need to be.
Thank you. Julia Clonis. I'm a consultant on development focusing in Africa and an economist with European ties. I say that so that I put the basis for my question. I found your presentation very illuminating, and yet I became concerned of overemphasis on the demographics, in demographics, religion, nationality, versus other concerns realistic, like in the European Union. There is a concern of the economic convergence, and Europeans are talking about this. They have accepted Turkey, for example, being an Islamic country, and of course, no matter what the French politicians said, the European Union has accepted it and negotiations have started it. And in Europe, at least from my standpoint, there is more or less surprise and concern for the urgency, quote unquote, appearing in certain academicians and so on, about Turkey getting into the European Union right away, and all of a sudden it is a religious issue, while many other countries, before entering the European Union, they had to work for 10 years, 15 years to bring their infrastructure, their economy into par, so that whatever meet the standards of the European Union. So to put in form a question, are we going a little bit too much in emphasizing the demographics and the religion and nationality versus other very practical concerns? Thank you.
If you could hand it to the gentleman right behind you there.
Thank you. Two short questions.
If you could tell us who you are, sir. Sorry.
Ron Levin, then that's who I'm with. Is there any impact of the change in the ratio of males to females, particularly in developing countries, China, India? And do you have any forecasts of the percent of European populations that will or may be Muslim in the next 10 to 20 years? Thank you.
Give it to that gentleman right there. Okay, why don't you guys go ahead with this?
Okay.
Yeah, Jack, why don't you go ahead?
All very good questions. On cost of health care and Medicare, yes. The nice thing about shifting health care from a health tourism to a long-term provision of retirement, nursing, and medical care in developing countries is that it's a win-win. Costs go down in terms of the obligations for health care provision on rich country governments, and opportunities go up for skill transfer, employment, education. The thing about health care is part of it is very low-tech, low-skill. Emptying bedpans, nursing care, carrying pills, helping wheelchair-bound people. That's labor-intensive and expensive to do in a developed country. Part of it is high-tech, high-skill, that is, sophisticated operations. What's interesting is a lot of developing countries are acquiring the capability to do those kind of high-skill operations, but they lack the local customer base. Hence, they're looking for tourism. But it's possible fairly quickly to build up a capacity. Las Vegas has become kind of a low-cost retirement center here, and it's become a leading center in heart research. Why? Because there's so many consumers of that specialty there. So I think it's win-win. It would be a reduced burden on Medicare. The problem is Americans don't want Medicare dollars spent abroad. And again, this is, I think, a lesson people have to learn, and maybe we'll learn it from contracting. I talked to Sharif Ghani, who was first finance minister of Afghanistan. He said, I got $1 billion in aid from the U.S., but 800 million of it had to go to U.S. companies. And they really didn't do what we wanted. They did what they thought they should do and took the money and left. Americans who are actually contributing tax money to help Afghanistan didn't get very much by insisting that a large portion of the foreign aid money go to U.S. firms. It may be hard to get European and American taxpayers to say your tax dollars for the welfare state or for Medicare should be spent on Mexican doctors or Persian doctors who are practicing in Muslim lands. Well, guess what? Go to a hospital in America. How many of the nurses and doctors are already immigrants from Persia, Mexico, other places where they can't work well? So it's the same people. It's just much more expensive to try and bring them all here and hire them there. So I think there are lots of aspects to this. As far as child health issues, investments abroad, standards, I actually think there are great opportunities to raise the standards of health care services and employment in the developing world by encouraging the flow of people back and forth. One of my colleagues at George Mason, who's an immigrant from Southeast Asia, just invented a cheap arsenic filter to help villagers have purified well water. He wouldn't have done that if he were an American and didn't really have a sense of the difficulty that ordinary villagers face getting clean well water. But his own village, people were getting sick. But he was an immigrant, but he solved the problem that's overseas. Another aspect of globalization that I like is McDonald's in Hong Kong. When McDonald's opened in Hong Kong, they had a problem. The Hong Kong employees would not clean the bathrooms. In McDonald's, bathrooms have to be spick and span. They have to be cleaned periodically, and they have to shine. This was way above the standard for bathroom care in Hong Kong, to the point where, Hong Kong would say, bathrooms in my home aren't this clean, and yet you want me to do this here in a commercial place? And McDonald's had to tough time. Hey, look, this is the way we do it. It's our standard. What happened? Did they lose business because of that? No. People actually decided this was a luxury. We were going to go to McDonald's not only to get the food, but they have really sparkling clean bathrooms. You got to see them. It was a high-tech innovation. And it caught on. Other restaurants had to raise the standard of sanitation in their bathroom facilities to compete. It turned out to be one of the nice aspects of globalization. It actually raised standards, as has been done in a lot of areas for fighting disease. So I think that this integration and globalization, there are downsides, but these horror stories of child labor and environmental disaster, this is what China's doing to itself. It's not what we're doing. There's a chance for sophisticated investment to create positive opportunities about raising standards. Now, this is also part of economic convergence. I mean, yes, there's an anxiety in Europe everywhere that if you bring people from poorer countries into the EU, they will lower everybody's living standard, the per capita income issue that was raised. But, people forget, when Spain and Greece and Portugal were admitted to the EU, they were very poor countries, and they had been under military dictatorships for a long time. And they were given a break on a lot of conditions on the basis of European solidarity and the hope of convergent standards. Ireland was a relatively poor country for much of the 50s and 60s. Ireland is now the richest country per capita in Western Europe, other than Norway. It's an amazing story of success due to opportunities for investment and exchange. Turkey will not stay as poor as it is if it becomes part of the EU. I think you've got a bigger problem perhaps with Romania. The real issue with Turkey, of course, is it's a very large country. It's going to have a large weight in EU affairs. Smaller countries like Belgium and Denmark are rightly concerned. What's going to happen? Well, right now the EU has an impossible organizational structure where Cyprus can veto the policies that are preferred by Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. So something is clearly wrong. Turkey cannot be admitted to the EU until EU has a type of governance structure that will balance three needs: the needs of large states, the needs of small states, and the needs of individual members of the EU to be heard as individuals and not be bound to the pull of their national leaders. Now that's a lot of work, but it is a major problem with or without Turkey, and so I think solving that will pave the way for easier EU expansion. Finally, the male-female ratio, is that a major demographic problem? There's a lot of concern. The Wilson Center has had a presentation on the ability of high technology allowing parents in India and China to abort female pregnancies in preference for having male children. I have to say that although I can be pretty pessimistic about a lot of things, I'm a skeptic on that one. China and India have had most of their history in which they were accustomed to dealing with somewhat skewed age ratios, because even without high tech, families could do preferential infanticide and preferential degree of child care and investment, so they tended to have unbalanced age structures. I also think some of the scarce statistics are based on faulty registration figures. We know in China that lots of families do not register female births because under the one-child policy they'd rather try to have a male child. And so they give the baby to relatives to be raised for a while, or they switch it with a child that's died and confuse the registration, and then the women pop up later. So that the age disparity in teen years is not as aggravated as you would expect from having looked at the age disparity in births 10 to 12 years earlier. So I think these countries can manage these. I also think China is not going to be as badly hit by its aging population as Europe, because the aged in China have not yet entrenched in law a ridiculously inflated level of automatic support for them in their old age. China does not have a welfare state on the model of Europe or the US. The elderly are still supported to the extent that they're cared for, largely by their families or with very small pensions. And their expectations are not much higher. We have ingrained fairly high expectations for comfortable and lengthy retirement for our elderly. I mean, we're looking at people who, even if they retire at 70, are very likely to live until 90 or 95. I mean, we're talking about not 5 or 10 years, but 20 or 25-year periods of retirement, even after age 70. I mean, I remember when the number of centenarians, people who reached 100 years old, that was so rare they'd be announced once in a while on the morning show as a big deal. Someone in the United States has reached their 100th birthday. Wow. Happens every week now. So we are going to have, even though they'll die eventually and solve the problem for our grandchildren, but for us, we're going to have an awful lot of people in their 80s and 90s who are going to be expected not to be warehoused in mean shacks, but are going to expect comfortable housing, good medical care, and the opportunity for enjoyable leisure. That's going to be a big demand.
Yeah, just briefly to the question on Hungary, I understand about the Treaty of Trianon, but I guess I was talking about the ethnic Magyar population. I mean, if you were to scratch down into the genealogies of a lot of so-called ethnic Magyars, I think you would find, especially after the dual monarchy, that they have other lineages to, say, Slovakian or Ruthenian or other groups. So I meant sort of assimilation into the Magyar group rather than what happened after Trianon. So, but that also, you're right, made Hungary. And of course, the Romani issue is the big issue there. There was a question somewhere on the proportion of Muslims in Western Europe in 10 or 20 years, and I think some of the work that David Coleman at Oxford has done suggests it'll be in the range of sort of 5 to 10%, not more than that. So again, not a dramatic proportion.
Okay. Question from Ritu.
Is this on?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Ritu Singh. I'm from USAID, the Office of Population and Reproductive Health. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I guess my question has to do with, Jack, your concept of polarization and the Muslim world versus the world. And I guess I was wondering how, in your past work and perhaps in this paper, how much you've broken down the Muslim world. It's not a monolithic world. And is it, Europe or the Western world versus the Muslims, or is it something deeper than that, and can it be disaggregated?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Jack. Answer that.
Well, it's a very profound question. In my historical work, I distinguish an enormous amount of variation in history, identity, religious practice within the Muslim world. What I find unfortunate in the current world is that many Americans have acquired a sense of a generalized Muslim threat. And I see this increasingly even in Europe, which has lived in greater proximity and involvement with the Muslim world and is more aware of its variation and complexities than Americans. For Americans, the Muslim world has always been, far away, and detail recedes with distance. But I do worry. When Sam Huntington wrote his book on the Clash of Civilizations, he was talking about possibilities and risks. He wasn't talking about something that's become inevitable. But the popularization of his view and the involvement of the United States in Iraq has led many people to pose the issue of the future world order in those terms. How is the U.S., how is Europe going to deal with the Muslim world as a whole? Frankly, I think one of the best policies is to fragment the Muslim world by taking those parts of it that are close to Europe and have a history of integration with Europe and embracing them and breaking them off, as it were. Other parts of the Muslim world, in Indonesia, the Muslim identity is not particularly a strong issue. It's not seen as an anti-Western issue. And I think that's the crucial issue. If being a Muslim is seen as a condition that requires a state of war with the West, which is precisely what Osama bin Laden is arguing. He says, to be a good Muslim, you must be hostile to what is an inevitable historical tendency of the West to try and take us over. If more Muslims adopt that, we are in for a dangerous and unpleasant world. On the other hand, if one argues that the Muslim faith is open, complex, generous, and varied, and is quite capable of coexisting as a set of communities interspersed with other communities, then we're going to a good place. So I would submit that the question you raise is one that is being defined as we speak by a lot of people with guns, a lot of people with sophisticated internet access, and a lot of people who are seeking political office. Now, I'm just an academic. I can only write about these things. But I'm hopeful that integration between the variety of Muslim communities and Western communities around the world is seen as a positive opportunity. That's my only hope for getting in a better world 20, 30 years from now.
Terrific. Well, I think we've come to the end of our hour, or 2 hours. I want to thank Eric and Jack for really very rich presentations, and thank you all for your... If I may just do one quick advertisement. First is for coming back to this topic in this particular meeting. On our website, we'll have a meeting summary and slides and the video. But next week, we're also tackling this demography and security, and particularly demography and violent conflict topic, with two other folks who are also experts and also promise to be quite interesting. Henrik Erdahl from PRIO, International Peace Research Institute, Oslo, will be here. This is at noon on Monday the 5th. And Jennifer Schuba, who is here in town, both doing her PhD on demography and security at University of Maryland, and also working at the Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary.